This week, Wyoming
just released golden eagles.
Millions of acres in Wyoming were dead, and the people living there were running out of money and hope. The grass was gone, and the cows were getting thinner every year because the ecosystem had lost its mind. To fix it, the government brought in 500 golden eagles to act as the new bosses of the desert. This sounds like a movie plot, but it is 100% real and much more violent than you might think. While everyone was looking at the cows, the eagles were focusing on a completely different animal. If you look a little closer, you find the real story of how fear can actually save the world. Wasteland Death Spiral. The red desert highlands of Wyoming looked less like a happy home for animals and more like a place where a war had just ended. We are talking about 2,440,000 acres of land that had been chewed down to absolute dust over many years. For more than a century, too many cows had been grazing on this land, and they stripped it bare. What used to be a prairie with grass as high as your waist turned into a hard floor of dirt and sadness. To say it was a big mess is not even the half of it. The soil had become so packed down from millions of heavy hooves that the ground acted like concrete. This is a detail that trips almost everyone up because they think dirt is just dirt, but when it gets packed this hard, it becomes a biological dead zone. When it finally did rain in this part of the country, the water did not soak into the dirt to help things grow. Instead, the water just skated off the surface in big sheets. This caused flash floods that ripped away the tiny bit of good soil that was left. The native grasses that belonged there, like western wheatgrass and blue grama, were totally gone. In their place was a nightmare plant called cheatgrass. If you know anything about the West, you know cheatgrass is a total disaster for everyone involved. It has almost zero nutrition for wildlife or cows, and it dries out so fast that it basically turns the desert into a massive pile of dry sticks. It is ready to burn faster than a fast car in a parking garage. Some people even believe there is a deeper mystery here. There are wild theories that the land was not just dying because of the cows, but because the very spirit of the soil had been broken. Some folks say that when you remove the big hunters from a land, the land itself forgets how to be alive. It enters a state of deep sleep, or even a slow death that no amount of human work can fix. Ranchers were at their breaking point and they did not know where to turn. This was not just a problem for birds and bugs. It was an economic crisis for every family in the area. To support a single cow, they needed more and more land because the food quality had dropped through the floor. It was a slow-motion disaster that everyone could see, but nobody could stop. The cows were getting thinner, the grass was getting harder to find, and the money was disappearing into the wind. The land was stuck in a death spiral where things just kept getting worse and worse every single day. If you take away all the noise, it is about the fact that the land was dying and taking the people with it. The dirt had become so dry and salty that even the bugs were starting to leave. When the bugs leave, the birds leave. And when the birds leave, the whole place feels like a graveyard. People started to wonder if this was the beginning of a new dust bowl that would swallow the entire state. There were even rumors that some of the land was becoming so toxic that nothing would ever grow there again for 1,000 years. This was the part that made absolutely no sense until you look at the real facts of how an ecosystem actually works. Wait, there is one big problem that was making the dirt turn into a desert even faster than before. Raptor release, gamble. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department came up with a plan that was so wild that half the people in town thought the scientists had gone crazy. The proposal was simple on paper, but it was very scary for the people who lived there. They wanted to bring in 500 golden eagles over a 5-year period. Now you have to think about what that really means for a second. They were not suggesting planting more seeds or building big pipes to bring in water. They were suggesting releasing 500 top-level hunters with 7-foot wingspans and claws that can crush bone. This was not some nice photo for a magazine. It was a plan to use these birds as a tool to fix the world. You can imagine how the ranchers felt at the big meetings. The rooms were very hot and people were shouting because they were already struggling to survive. The last thing they wanted was a sky full of giant birds that looked at a baby cow and saw a tasty lunch. One rancher stood up and told the experts that adding more hunters was like trying to fix a broken truck by setting it on fire. Honestly, it was a very fair point to make. On the surface, the whole idea made zero sense at all. Some people even whispered that the government wanted the eagles there to push the ranchers off their land. There are wild theories that the eagles were just a cover story for a much bigger plan to turn the whole state into a giant park where no humans are allowed to live. But here is where it gets tricky. The biologists had done a lot of reading, and they knew something the ranchers did not know yet. They knew that the real reason the land was dying was not just the cows. It was a huge imbalance involving a completely different animal. This animal was destroying the ground from below while the cows were destroying it from above. The biologists were betting everything on a big idea called a trophic cascade. That is just a fancy way of saying what happens when you put the big boss back in charge of the woods. But to make this work, they had to go after an animal that most people think is cute. In reality, this little animal was acting like a biological bulldozer that was ruining everything. The ranchers were not ready to hear the truth, and the tension in the room was thick. The state was asking them to trust a giant predator to save their cows. It was a gamble of epic proportions that could ruin the whole town if it went wrong. Some scientists even worried that the eagles might leave the area and fly to the mountains where it was easier to find food. If the birds left, the millions of dollars spent would be totally wasted. It was a high-stakes game where the prize was the future of the American West. But there is a bit of a snag that involves a hidden enemy living right under the ranchers' feet. Mental game prey. To understand why they needed eagles, you have to understand the prairie dog. Before you think about a cute little animal standing on its back legs, you need to know what they actually do to the land. They are like little engineers that change everything. A single prairie dog town can cover hundreds of acres and hold thousands of animals. They dig all the time. In a healthy world, this is actually a good thing for the dirt. Their tunnels let air into the soil and let water go deep into the earth instead of running away. Their waste makes the ground better for plants. They cut the grass, which sounds bad, but it actually helps new grass grow and stops one plant from taking over everything. In a balanced world, the prairie dog is a hero. But the Wyoming highlands were not balanced at all. The land was broken. When cows eat too much grass, the grass stays very short. Prairie dogs love short grass because it helps them see a hunter coming from far away. So when the cows chewed the grass down, the prairie dogs moved in and had lots of babies. It was a perfect storm of trouble. Most folks have no idea that without natural hunters, prairie dog numbers explode like crazy. A healthy town might have 10 or 15 animals on an acre of land. In this part of Wyoming, that number was hitting 50 or 60 animals on every single acre. At those high numbers, they are not helping the dirt anymore. They are stripping it bare. They eat so much that the good grass cannot grow back. They win the fight for every single blade of green grass against the cows. Their homes became so big that they turned the fields into something that looked like the moon. There are even darker theories about these prairie dog towns. Some researchers think that when their numbers get too high, they actually change the local weather. By stripping the land of all green plants, the ground gets much hotter. This hot ground pushes away rain clouds, creating a tiny desert that grows bigger every day. It sounds like science fiction, but some people believe the rodents were literally terraforming the state into a dust bowl. It creates a strange problem where the animal that should help the land is the thing stopping it from getting better. They were locking the land in a state where nothing could heal. And it was not just the prairie dogs causing trouble. The ecosystem was missing its natural medicine. In the past, wolves and bears kept these numbers low. But those big hunters were gone. That left the door open for the coyote. With no big bosses around, coyote numbers went through the roof. You might think coyotes would eat the prairie dogs, and they do, but they are lazy hunters. They found an easier meal by hunting baby antelope and deer. Wyoming had over 1 million antelope once, but that number dropped to 400,000. In some places, 80% of the babies were not living past their first month. Wyoming had a long list of disasters that were all connected. Fast forward a little bit, and things looked totally different once the shadows started moving across the dirt. Beef weight bonus. The first group of eagles was let go in the spring of the year 2020. These were 50 young birds, and each one had a GPS unit powered by the sun on its back. This let the scientists watch every move they made. At first, not much happened, and the birds just moved around. Some of the birds died, which is normal because life in the wild is very hard for young eagles, but enough of them stayed alive to start the real work. By the fall of that year, the scientists saw something very strange in their data. They looked at the prairie dog towns and saw that activity had dropped by 40%. Most people look right past this part, but it was not because the eagles had eaten all of those animals. An eagle can only eat so much in one day. It was impossible for 50 birds to eat that many rodents. So, what was actually happening? This is where the landscape of fear comes into play. It is one of the strongest forces in nature, but nobody talks about it. Animals do not just run when a hunter is chasing them. They change their whole lives based on the chance of being hunted. The prairie dogs knew the eagles were in the sky. They could see the shadows and hear the wind in their feathers. So instead of spending 12 hours a day eating grass, they spent 20 hours a day hiding in their holes. They stopped going far away from their front doors. They were basically stuck in their bunkers. With the prairie dogs hiding, the grass finally had a chance to breathe. It was not instant, but green plants started pushing through the hard dirt. And we are not talking about that bad cheat grass. We are talking about the good native plants like Indian ricegrass. These plants have deep roots that hold the dirt together and help it survive when there is no rain. In the spring of 2021, the state let go another 100 birds. Now, the first group of birds was getting older and protecting their homes. The zone of fear was getting bigger and bigger. It was like a blanket of pressure over the whole area. With the rodent numbers falling back to a normal level, the plants grew even faster. The eagle's presence wasn't just a visual change in the landscape, it represented a tactical pivot in the desert's power structure. They weren't merely scanning the scrub for rodents anymore. Instead, they turned their predatory focus toward a more significant target: the young coyotes. This shift sent a shockwave through the local hierarchy. Suddenly, the coyotes, creatures that usually moved with a sense of undisputed ownership, found themselves vulnerable from above. They began to fear the sky. This newfound dread forced the adult coyotes to abandon their daylight patrols. To avoid the golden shadows sweeping over the brush, they retreated into the darkness, limiting their hunting to the safety of the night. This behavioral shift provided an unexpected window of opportunity for the pronghorn antelope. With the coyotes suppressed by the aerial threat, the fawns enjoyed a rare, safe interval to graze and gain strength, without the constant threat of a ground-level ambush. It felt as though the entire ecosystem was finally waking up from a long, stagnant sleep. A forgotten equilibrium was returning to the plains. The sun fueled the lush grass. The grass sustained the roaming cattle, and the apex hunters maintained the discipline of the wild. As the eagles dominated the thermals, legends began to circulate among the ranchers and observers watching from the periphery. Some whispered that the birds were communicating across vast stretches of the desert, sharing intelligence like a coordinated unit. There is even a fringe theory suggesting that the GPS units attached to some of the birds for research were being utilized by the flock as a sort of organic digital network. Though most dismiss this as a modern myth, The reality is far more impressive than any technology. With vision 8 times more powerful than a human's, these birds didn't need a network. They were conducting a high-altitude military operation, patrolling their territory with a biological precision that turned the desert into a strictly regulated domain. But it is not as easy as it looks to convince a grumpy rancher that his enemies are friends. The weight of gold. A rancher's life is governed by a single, unforgiving metric: the scale. To a man like Bill, who had spent 40 years watching the horizon for rain that rarely came, a cow wasn't just an animal, it was a walking bank account. In the high desert of Wyoming, the margin between a profitable year and losing the family legacy is measured in ounces. You sell by the pound, and every pound is a battle, won against a landscape that wants to turn everything into dust. By the fall of 2021, the Wyoming basin looked like a wasteland. The sun had spent the summer scouring the earth, and the wind carried away whatever topsoil hadn't already been baked into a hard ceramic crust. Usually, this time of year is a season of mourning for a rancher's ledger. The cows should have been slab-sided, ribs showing, coats dull and dusty, their energy spent trekking 5 or 10 miles a day just to find a few sprigs of cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is the junk food of the plains. It's dry, brittle, and offers about as much nutrition as a cardboard box. In a bad year, a cow burns more calories looking for food than the food actually provides. It's a slow-motion starvation that eats away at the rancher's soul. But when Bill rode out to the North Pasture that October, he didn't see starving animals. He saw ghosts of a different era. His herd looked like they had been pampered in a Midwestern corn lot. They were round, heavy-hipped, and their coats had a deep, oily sheen that caught the autumn light. Bill rubbed his eyes, wondering if the heat had finally gotten to him. The weather hadn't changed. It was still a brutal, dry year. Yet, the grass beneath the cows' hooves wasn't the yellowed, invasive cheatgrass he'd fought for decades. It was blue bunch wheatgrass and needle and thread, native species that hadn't been seen in these densities since his grandfather's time. The reason was as simple as it was terrifying to the old-timers: the eagles. The prairie dogs, which had turned the plains into a moonscape of holes and dirt, were suddenly nowhere to be seen. Or rather, they were hiding. With the reintroduction of the golden and bald eagles, the fear factor had returned to the desert. The prairie dogs weren't just being eaten, they were being suppressed. They stayed underground, and in their absence, the native grass, the steak dinner of the cattle world, had roared back to life. Bill sat in his kitchen that night with a calculator and a legal pad. The numbers didn't make sense, and yet they were right there in black and white. His cows were averaging 60 pounds heavier than the 2-year rolling average. In a herd of 500, that was 30,000 extra pounds of beef. At market prices, that translated to $45,000 in pure, unexpected profit. That wasn't just extra money. That was a new tractor. That was a daughter's college tuition. That was the difference between keeping the ranch and selling it to a developer from California. It was during these quiet nights that the wild theories started to circulate at the local diner. Bill heard a man from the university suggest the vibrational predator theory. The idea was that the high-pitched screams of the eagles and the literal shadow of their wings didn't just scare the rodents. They sent a biological signal to the soil itself. Some argued that the stress hormones released by the prey animals, filtered into the ground through their waste, acted as a high-potency chemical trigger that told dormant native seeds it was finally safe to germinate. Others went further, suggesting that the eagles were acting as atmospheric shepherds, using their massive wingspans to create microvortexes in the heat thermals that actually help trap moisture closer to the ground, creating a cool cap over the pastures they patrolled. Bill didn't know about vibrations or vortexes, but he knew what he saw. He went to the local grazing association meeting, a place where just 3 years ago, men had talked about shooting eagles on sight, and stood up. He told them his bank account was full because the sky was full of talons. He told them he would personally protect every eagle nest on his land, because those birds were doing more for his bottom line than the government ever had. The Great Green Engine. By the dawn of 2023, the Wyoming experiment had moved from a local curiosity to a global phenomenon. The state had released a total of 350 eagles, and the results were staggering. The native grass cover had increased by 35% across the pilot zones. The program had cost the state and private donors about $8.2 million, but the estimated return for the ranching industry was hovering around $30 million in new revenue. The birds weren't just ecological residents. They were the most efficient employees the state had ever hired. But as the grass grew taller, the wild theories grew even more daring. With the return of the grass came the return of the sage grouse, a bird so sensitive to land health that it acts like a biological barometer. Their numbers jumped 18% in 24 months. This led to the emergence of the Pleistocene memory theory. Some radical biologists began arguing that the land has a memory of when it was populated by megafauna, mammoths, giant bison, and massive raptors. They suggested that by bringing back the eagles, we hadn't just fixed a food chain. We had flipped a genetic switch in the ecosystem. The theory posited that the presence of a top-tier aerial predator realigned the Earth's local geomagnetic field in a way that encouraged massive carbon sequestration. Proponents claimed that the healthy native grass was now pulling carbon out of the atmosphere at 4 times the rate of a standard forest. They called it the green lung theory, suggesting that if this eagle-led rewilding were scaled globally, the sheer breathing power of the restored grasslands could stabilize the planet's shifting climate within a decade. It sounded like science fiction, the idea that a bird's hunt could change the temperature of the globe. But in the lush green valleys of Wyoming that used to look like Mars, it was hard to argue with results. Of course, the success brought a new kind of shadow. In the town of Casey, rumors began to swirl about the urban apex shift. Some folks whispered that the eagles were getting too smart, too comfortable. There were stories, never proven, always told in hushed tones over coffee, of small pets vanishing from fenced yards in a broad daylight. A wild theory circulated among the more conspiratorial residents that the eagles were developing a collective intelligence, coordinating their hunts across hundreds of miles, using a form of low-frequency communication that humans couldn't detect. They wondered if, once the prairie dogs were gone, the boss of the sky would look toward the towns for its next meal. Even more radical was the tundra trigger proposal. Encouraged by the Wyoming success, a group of international scientists suggested that the next step wasn't just birds, but the return of the giants. They argued that if 500 eagles could save a desert, 1,000 cloned woolly mammoths could save the permafrost. They believed these ancient beasts would tramp down the snow, insulating the ground and preventing the release of ancient methane. It was the same logic Bill had seen on his ranch. The right animal, in the right place, creates a ripple effect that fixes the engine of nature in ways no machine ever could. Despite the fringe fears and the what-ifs, the reality on the ground was undeniable. The dirt was turning green. The antelope fawns, no longer losing their legs to prairie dog holes or starving on cheatgrass, were surviving at record rates. The land looked like Wyoming again, a sea of waving silver-green grass, teeming with life. Bill stood on his porch as the sun dipped below the Bighorn Mountains. He watched a golden eagle circle high above his prize heifers. It occurred to him then that for 100 years, humans had tried to manage the land with steel, chemicals, and lead. We had tried to be the bosses of the earth, and we had nearly turned it into a graveyard. It took a bird with a 6-foot wingspan and a heart of stone to show us that we were never in charge. The eagle wasn't just a predator. It was the conductor of an ancient orchestra. And as long as the music kept playing, the cows would stay heavy, the grass would stay green, and the family ranch would live to see another generation. If a single bird can save an entire economy, why are we still so afraid of predators? Is it possible that the animals we fear the most are the ones we need? If you want to see more stories of nature winning, like and subscribe for more.